Jesus before Pilate, the weight of betrayal and judgment. The hall of judgment was filled with a restless energy as Jesus was brought before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. The morning light streamed through the open corridors, but the air was suffocating, heavy with the tension of an impending verdict. Jesus stood bound, his face calm yet marked by the bruises and fatigue of the previous night. His silence, a stark contrast to the chaos surrounding him, only deepened the unease in the room. Pilate sat upon the judgment seat, his posture one of reluctant authority. Though he was accustomed to handling unruly crowds and difficult cases, there was something about this man standing before him that unsettled him. He studied Jesus, searching for something: weakness, guilt, defiance, but found none. Pilate, his tone probing, almost hesitant. "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus lifted his eyes to meet Pilate's, his gaze steady and unwavering. His voice, when he answered, was calm but carried an authority that seemed to echo beyond the walls of the hall. "Jesus, it is as you say." Pilate leaned back, his brow furrowing. He glanced at the chief priests and elders, who stood nearby, their faces tight with accusation and satisfaction. They hurled charges at Jesus, their voices rising in a cacophony of anger and venom. Yet through it all, Jesus remained silent. He did not flinch, did not retaliate, did not defend himself. Pilate, leaning forward, his tone almost pleading, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" But Jesus said nothing. His silence was not born of fear, but of a profound resolve, a willingness to accept what was to come. Pilate was amazed, bewildered by this man who stood with such dignity amidst the onslaught of hatred. He had seen countless men beg and plead for their lives in this very hall, but Jesus did neither. As the morning wore on, the crowd outside grew larger and more unruly. It was the feast of Passover, and the custom of releasing a prisoner to the people loomed over the proceedings. Pilate, sensing an opportunity to absolve himself of the decision, presented them with a choice. Inside the hall, Barabbas, a notorious criminal, was brought forward. His face was hardened, his eyes sharp with malice. He stood in stark contrast to Jesus, whose calm and gentle demeanor seemed almost otherworldly. Pilate addressed the crowd, his voice carrying over the clamor. "Pilate, whom do you want me to release for you? Barabbas, or Jesus who is called Christ?" He glanced at the chief priests and elders, aware of their envy and manipulation. Pilate was no fool. He knew they had handed Jesus over not for justice, but out of jealousy. Still, he hoped the crowd might choose wisely. Surely, they would not call for the release of a man like Barabbas over this innocent teacher. As Pilate waited for their answer, a messenger hurried into the hall and approached him with urgency. It was a message from his wife. Messenger, reading aloud, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for last night I suffered greatly in a dream because of him." Pilate's hand tightened on the arm of his seat. Even his wife, far removed from the fray, had been troubled by this man's innocence. The words gnawed at him, a quiet warning in the midst of the growing chaos. But outside, the chief priests and elders worked tirelessly, moving among the crowd, whispering into ears, stoking the flames of hatred and fear. When Pilate returned to the crowd, he asked again, his voice carrying a note of frustration. "Pilate, which of the two do you want me to release for you?" The response was deafening and immediate. Crowd, "Barabbas!" The name echoed through the courtyard, a chilling testament to the sway of mob mentality. Pilate's jaw tightened. He looked at Jesus, standing silent and composed, and then back to the crowd. Pilate, his voice firm but tinged with disbelief. "Then what shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ?" The crowd surged forward, their shouts growing louder, more frenzied. Crowd, "Crucify him!" Pilate's eyes widened. He stood, raising his hands to quiet the crowd. Pilate, almost pleading, "Why? What evil has he done?" But the crowd's cries drowned him out. Their voices, filled with rage and bloodlust, rose to a fever pitch. Crowd. Crucify him! Crucify him! Pilate's shoulders sagged under the weight of the moment. He could see that reasoning with them was futile. The crowd, manipulated and enraged, would accept nothing less than Jesus' death. And worse, a riot seemed imminent. Pilate, fearing the political consequences, made his choice. He called for water to be brought to him, and, in a gesture of public abdication, washed his hands before the crowd. Pilate, his voice weary and resigned, "I am innocent of this man's blood, see to that yourselves." The crowd's response was chilling. Crowd. His blood shall be on us and on our children. The words struck like a dagger, their venom reverberating through the air. Pilate glanced at Jesus one last time, his face heavy with guilt and reluctant resolve. Then, with a wave of his hand, he ordered Barabbas to be released, and Jesus to be scourged and handed over for crucifixion. As Jesus was led away, the crowd erupted in chaotic celebration. The noise was deafening, but within the hall, a profound silence lingered. Pilate sat motionless, his hands still wet from the water, staring at them as though trying to wash away not just the physical stain, but the guilt he knew would remain. And Jesus, beaten yet unbroken, walked forward with a quiet resolve. His steps carried him closer to the cross, to the fulfillment of the greatest act of love the world would ever know. The crowd's cries faded into the background, but the echo of his silence, his grace, and his strength would reverberate for eternity. The mocking and humiliation of Jesus. The narrow halls of the Praetorium were filled with the sharp clang of metal and the murmurs of soldiers preparing for their next cruel act. Jesus was dragged into the center of the room, his hands bound and his body already bearing the marks of the beatings and scourging. The Roman cohort gathered around him, their faces hard with disdain, their laughter sharp and hollow. To them, he was nothing more than a joke, a man claimed to be King of the Jews. His dignity, his purpose, his holiness, they mocked it all with every gesture, every word. The soldiers stripped him of his garments, exposing his bruised and bloodied flesh. The air was cold against his skin, and his body trembled, not from fear, but from the physical toll of the night's torment. They brought forth a scarlet robe and draped it over his shoulders. The fabric, meant to symbolize royalty, now hung mockingly on the man they scorned. Each movement was deliberate, cruel in its sarcasm. One soldier, grinning wickedly, twisted together a crude crown of thorns. His hands worked quickly, the sharp points tearing into his fingers as he pressed the thorns into a vicious circle. With a flourish, he approached Jesus and shoved the crown onto his head. The thorns pierced his scalp, fresh streams of blood mingling with the sweat on his face. His expression tightened in pain, but he did not cry out. His silence, his endurance, only enraged them further. Another soldier shoved a reed into his hand, a mocking scepter, and with exaggerated gestures, the men knelt before him. They jeered loudly, their voices dripping with contempt. Soldiers, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Their laughter echoed harshly, filling the chamber like a haunting melody of cruelty. Some spat on him, the spittle landing on his face and the robe, an added layer of degradation. Others took the reed from his hand, using it to strike him on the head. Each blow drove the thorns deeper into his flesh, but still, he did not retaliate. He stood silently, bearing their hatred, their mockery, with a strength that defied understanding. The soldiers, though drunk on their own cruelty, began to feel the weight of his silence. They expected him to lash out, to curse them, to plead for mercy. But he did none of these. His silence was unyielding, his eyes filled not with hatred, but with sorrow, a sorrow not for himself, but for them. This quiet, unspoken love only served to deepen their disdain. How could someone like him endure this without breaking? Their pride demanded that they push harder, hit harder, mock louder. When they finally grew bored of their own game, they ripped the scarlet robe from his shoulders. The coarse fabric tore at the wounds on his back, causing fresh blood to seep through his garments. They forced his own clothes back onto him, their sneers and jeers continuing as they prepared to lead him away. The streets were already alive with the murmur of a gathering crowd as Jesus was led out of the praetorium. The people jostled for space along the narrow roads, their faces filled with a mixture of emotions, some with genuine sorrow, others with scornful satisfaction. The soldiers barked orders, their voices sharp as they moved to clear a path. Jesus, weakened by the scourging and the weight of all that he bore, staggered under the burden of the cross they placed on his shoulders. Each step was labored, his body trembling with effort. His breath came shallow and ragged, and yet he pressed forward. Among the onlookers was Simon of Cyrene, an outsider, a bystander who had not come to be part of this spectacle. He was plucked from the crowd by the soldiers, his protests ignored as they pressed him into service. They shoved him toward Jesus and ordered him to carry the cross. Simon hesitated, his heart pounding with fear and confusion. But as he moved closer to the man he was to help, his eyes met Jesus. What he saw stopped him in his tracks: the silent suffering, the overwhelming sorrow, but also a love so profound it seemed to transcend the agony. Without another word, Simon lifted the cross and bore its weight alongside him. The crowd followed, their voices rising in a chaotic mix of shouts and sobs. Some wept quietly, their hearts breaking for the man they believed to be innocent. Others hurled insults, their hatred fanned by the manipulations of the priests. The air was thick with tension, the weight of the moment pressing down on all who bore witness. Yet through it all, Jesus moved forward, each step carrying him closer to the place of ultimate sacrifice. His silence, his resolve, and his love filled the air, even as the crowd mocked and scorned him. He bore their hatred, their sin, their brokenness, not with anger, but with an unyielding grace that would soon change the course of history. The agony and glory of the crucifixion. The path to Golgotha had been brutal, yet the final destination was more harrowing than any bystander could have foreseen. As they reached the place of the skull, the ominous name Golgotha seemed to whisper from the cracked stones beneath their feet. The air here was heavy, suffused with the cries of an unjustly condemned man, the jeers of the bloodthirsty crowd, and the quiet grief of those who loved him. Jesus was weak, his body trembling under the weight of his punishment. Every step had drained him further, but he carried not just the physical burden of the cross, but the spiritual weight of the world's sins. As they prepared him for the cruelest act of Roman execution, the soldiers moved with mechanical precision. This was a task they had performed too many times to count, and they were indifferent to the man they were about to nail to the wooden beams. The soldiers thrust Jesus onto the rough, splintered cross. His hands were stretched out, the tendons taut, his wrists pinned to the wood. The sound of the hammer driving the iron nails into his flesh rang out, a sickening echo that silenced even the mocking crowd for a moment. His blood stained the wood, crimson streams trailing down toward the dusty earth. He did not cry out, his lips quivered, his body arched in pain, but not a word of protest passed from him. The cross was lifted, and as it fell into its place in the ground with a jarring thud, his weight shifted. The agony worsened, the nails pulling at his torn hands and feet, his shoulders straining from the unnatural position. Each breath was a struggle, a battle against his failing body, and yet he endured. Above his head, a sign was affixed: "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." It was intended as mockery, a message to the onlookers to belittle his claim. But to those who knew him, those who believed, the words spoke a profound truth. They gazed up at him, their hearts breaking as they saw their king, their savior, humiliated and suffering. Beneath the cross, the soldiers divided his garments among themselves, casting lots as though it were some mundane game. The indignity of the act added a fresh sting to the scene. To the onlookers, the soldiers' laughter was a sharp contrast to the muffled weeping of a few faithful followers who stood farther away, unable to look but unable to leave. Passers-by hurled insults at him, their faces twisted with disdain. Mocker in the crowd: "You who were going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." The chief priests, who had orchestrated his crucifixion, joined in with their venomous derision. "Chief priest, he saved others. but he cannot save himself. If he is the King of Israel, let him come down now, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him if he delights in him." Even the criminals crucified on either side of him added their voices to the mockery. Their bitterness spilled out, mingling with the jeers of the crowd. But Jesus remained silent. As the hours passed, the sky itself seemed to grieve. At the 6th hour, an unnatural darkness swept over the land, blanketing Golgotha in a foreboding gloom. The jeering waned as unease settled over the crowd. Mothers held their children close. Soldiers tightened their grips on their spears. The sun's absence felt like a condemnation of the horror unfolding. Jesus hung there, his body ravaged by pain, his mind weighed down by the crushing separation from his Father. He bore not only the nails and thorns but the sins of the world, every lie, every betrayal, every act of hatred. He bore it all, and it was this that made him cry out, his voice a heart-wrenching echo through the darkness. "Jesus, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani? My God, why have you forsaken me?" The crowd murmured in confusion. "Onlooker, he's calling for Elijah." A man, moved by a flicker of pity, grabbed a sponge soaked in sour wine, lifted it to Jesus on a reed, and held it to his lips. Yet even this small act of compassion was met with derision. Another onlooker, "Let's see if Elijah comes to save him." Jesus took a final, shuddering breath. He lifted his eyes toward heaven, his face, though marred by pain, radiating a sense of resolve and love that pierced the hearts of those watching. And then, with a voice that seemed to carry the weight of the heavens, he cried out one last time. The words were not recorded in this moment, but their power reverberated across eternity. And then, he yielded up his spirit. The silence that followed was oppressive, as if the earth itself mourned. Suddenly, the ground trembled violently. Rocks split apart, their fractures echoing through the hills. In the temple, the veil that had long separated humanity from the presence of God was torn in two, from top to bottom. It was as though heaven itself reached down to declare the end of an old era and the beginning of a new covenant. Graves were opened, and the dead were raised, their appearance in the city leaving onlookers trembling in awe. The crowd, which had moments before been mocking and jeering, was now gripped with terror. Centurion, his voice shaking with the enormity of the realization. Truly this was the Son of God. At a distance, the women who had followed Jesus watched through tear-streaked faces. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee stood huddled together, their hearts breaking. Their sobs were quiet but uncontrollable, each one feeling the loss as though it were their own breath being taken from them. Mary Magdalene clutched her chest, her cries barely audible above the trembling earth. She could not take her eyes off the cross. She had followed him, believed in him, been healed by him. And now, he was gone. Every promise he had made seemed distant, like a dream fading into despair. The crowd began to disperse, their mocking silenced, their faces pale with fear and confusion. But for those who loved him, the pain lingered, deep and unrelenting. The man they had called Lord, Teacher, Friend, was gone. Golgotha, once noisy and chaotic, now stood eerily quiet, save for the occasional wail of the wind. And yet, in the heaviness of that moment, in the heart of that grief, a seed of hope had been planted. For though they could not yet see it, this was not the end. It was the beginning of a victory that would shake the foundations of the world. The burial of Jesus. Evening had settled over the land, a solemn stillness replacing the chaos of the day. The sun's dim light painted the horizon in hues of amber and ash, as if creation itself mourned the death of its creator. Golgotha, the site of unspeakable suffering, now stood eerily quiet, the echoes of mocking laughter and cries of agony fading into the silence. From the shadows emerged a man, Joseph of Arimathea. A wealthy man of influence, Joseph had silently admired and followed Jesus, his faith kept hidden until this moment. Yet now, his heart could no longer bear the thought of leaving Jesus to the indignity of remaining on the cross, exposed to the elements. Summoning all his courage, Joseph made his way to Pilate's quarters, each step heavy with purpose. When he reached Pilate, Joseph's voice was steady, though grief trembled at its edges. "Joseph, I ask for the body of Jesus." Pilate, fatigued from the day's turmoil, regarded Joseph with mild surprise. For a moment, the governor weighed the request, then nodded, his gesture one of reluctant acquiescence. "Pilate, the body is yours." Joseph's heart pounded as he left Pilate's presence, his sorrow mixed with determination. He knew the risks of associating with a condemned man, of revealing his allegiance to Jesus. Yet none of it mattered anymore. Love and devotion had overcome fear. Gathering clean linen, Joseph returned to Golgotha to reclaim the broken body of his Lord. The scene before him was almost too much to bear. Jesus' lifeless form hung on the cross, his hands and feet pierced, his body bruised and torn. The sky above was still cloaked in an unnatural gloom, casting long shadows over the hill. With tender care, Joseph, assisted by Nicodemus, another silent follower, lowered the body. Tears streamed down their faces as they worked, each movement deliberate, as though reverence alone could compensate for the cruelty inflicted. They wrapped him in the linen, the cloth slowly absorbing the blood and sweat that marked his suffering. Joseph's hands trembled as he secured the folds, his fingers brushing against the wounds left by the nails. Each touch felt sacred, a heartbreaking reminder of the sacrifice Jesus had made. Joseph had prepared a tomb for himself, a new, untouched resting place hewn into the rock. It was a mark of his wealth and status, yet he now found no hesitation in giving it up for his Lord. As they carried Jesus' body toward the tomb, the weight was more than physical. It was the weight of grief, the weight of lost hope, the weight of dreams shattered on a cross. When they reached the tomb, the stillness of the moment was profound. The air seemed to hang heavy, the quiet broken only by the soft rustle of the linen shroud. Joseph and Nicodemus gently laid the body on the stone slab within the tomb. The space was dark and cold, yet there was an inexplicable peace, as though heaven itself bore silent witness. Joseph stepped back, his chest heaving with suppressed sobs. With a deep breath, he rolled the massive stone over the entrance, the grinding sound reverberating across the quiet hillside. The finality of the gesture crushed him. This was goodbye. Not far from the tomb, two women sat in vigil. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, had followed Jesus faithfully from Galilee, ministering to him, believing in him. Now, they sat opposite the grave, their eyes fixed on the stone that sealed the tomb. They didn't speak, their grief too vast for words. Tears flowed freely down their cheeks, their hearts shattered under the weight of the loss. Mary Magdalene clutched her arms around herself, her mind a storm of memories. The moment Jesus called her by name, the life he had restored to her, the hope he had kindled. And now, that hope lay behind the stone. She could not fathom a world without him, yet she could not bring herself to leave. The following morning. The morning sun barely penetrated the gloom of the next day, the light struggling to warm a city weighed down by the events of the previous day. The chief priests and Pharisees, however, were already in motion. Fear lingered in their hearts, not of repentance or guilt, but of losing the fragile control they had fought to maintain. They gathered before Pilate, their robes swishing as they moved with purpose. Chief priest: "Sir, we remember that when he was alive, this deceiver said, 'After 3 days I am to rise again.'" Their voices dripped with disdain, yet the undercurrent of unease was unmistakable. Chief priest: "Give orders for the grave to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal him away, saying to the people, 'He has risen from the dead.' The last deception will be worse than the first." Pilate, weary of their plotting, waved a hand dismissively. "Pilate, you have a guard, make it as secure as you know how." Satisfied, the priests left, their faces a mixture of triumph and paranoia. They stationed guards around the tomb, their armor glinting in the daylight. A seal was placed on the stone, a symbol of authority meant to deter tampering. The scene became one of cold vigilance, the soldiers' stern faces contrasting with the stillness of the tomb. The world seemed to hold its breath. The tomb, silent and lifeless, held within it the greatest mystery of all. For the disciples, it was a place of despair. For the chief priests, it was a place of fear. For Mary and the other women, it was a place of love and sorrow. But heaven knew it as the stage for what was yet to come.